They taped the notice to my door like it was a warning shot fired in the dead of night. No knock, no preamble, just piece of paper fluttering in the wind like death sentence. I stood there, key still in hand, reading those bold letters that told me I had 30 days to disappear like I was some squatter who'd wandered too far from the city. I almost laughed, almost, but the absurdity was too familiar to be funny. When power masquerades as procedure, when HOA officials believe their paper trails are stronger than bedrock, what they're really doing is declaring war. And like every war, this one began long before the first shot was fired. I wasn't supposed to be here. I never planned to return to Silver Lake, never mind inherit battle. My life in Seattle had been predictable, stable. I worked as land surveyor, mapping boundaries, drawing lines in the dirt for developers who believed ownership began and ended with ink. I'd mapped hundreds of properties, memorized GPS coordinates, chased corners buried under decades of brush and bureaucratic laziness. But none of that prepared me for the lines my grandfather had drawn, not with ink, with conviction. 3 months ago, Robert Thornton passed away, quietly like everything he did. No spectacle, just note from his attorney, and then key to cabin on the edge of the lake I hadn't seen since I was a boy. A place that lived in the corners of my childhood, filtered through the smell of pine and the sound of water lapping against old wooden docks. Grandpa never left Silver Lake, not really. He left Seattle behind, the noise, the politics, the ambitions of men who traded land like poker chips. He chose quiet. He chose to stay, and now apparently so had I. The cabin hadn't changed. Still weathered logs and river stone. Still the wraparound porch that faced morning sun. Still the crooked mailbox that leaned like it was listening to secrets whispered by the wind. Inside, the air smelled like cedar and dust and something older than either. Like memory, the furniture was heavy and handmade, the fireplace still blackened from the last winter he'd lived through. His books still lined the shelves, titles worn smooth by time and use. He hadn't just lived here, he had built this space to outlast him. The first weekend I arrived with my grandfather's old pickup, I felt the eyes before I saw the faces. Subs lined the neighboring like armor, perfect hedges, white gravel paths, houses that looked more like investments than homes. I didn't belong. I knew that before the engine cooled. Then she appeared, blonde hair pulled into a ponytail so tight it could have been a weapon, manicured nails, a clipboard, a smile that stopped just before her eyes. You must be Robert's grandson, she said, offering a hand that smelled like lavender and control. I'm Margaret Winters, president of the Silver Pine Homeowners Association. We were very sorry to hear about Robert's passing. He was unique. She let that word hang. Mosquito in the air. I shook her hand. Trevor Thornton. I'm still settling in. Well, she said, eyeing the cabin as if it were an infection, the community has evolved quite a bit. We pride ourselves on maintaining certain aesthetic standard, especially for properties visible from the lakefront. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. She wasn't finished. You'll be receiving our welcome packet. It contains all the guidelines for compliance. You'll want to review it carefully. She smiled, more teeth than warmth. Also, that truck. We asked that vintage or recreational vehicles be parked behind the residence. Street visibility tends to affect property values. Before I could tell her it wasn't recreational, that it was my daily driver, she was already walking away, photographing another house, another file for whatever empire she was building. That night, I stood on the porch with beer in hand and question in my gut. What was she so afraid of? The answer came from the woman next door. Ellie Collins, high school biology teacher, warm smile, blue cabin. Don't mind the Queen of Pines, she said. She thinks she possessed building Rome out here. Your grandfather. He was the last thing in her way. We sat on my porch and watched the lake go dark. She told me about the fines, the rule changes, the old families who had packed up and left when compliance became too expensive. Your grandfather never gave in, she said. She hated that night I found the study and the filing cabinets. Robert Thornton didn't believe in digital records. He believed in paper and permanence. And in every drawer I opened, he proved it. Hand-drawn survey maps, notarized copies of deeds, correspondence with lawyers, letters from the county office, all of it meticulously organized. My grandfather didn't just live here. He defended this land like it was the final front in war. No one else knew was happening. He knew every tree, every foot of shoreline. And according to his records, he didn't just own the cabin and the 10 acres surrounding it. Majority stake in the lake itself, 60%. Including the dock, the clubhouse, the land beneath the HOA's proud little monument to itself. And suddenly the eviction notice made sense. She wasn't trying to remove an eyesore. She was trying to erase problem, the last holdout, the last living obstacle to marketing brochure Thomas Winters, her husband and developer, had already printed. When I was 12, I'd fished off the community dock with Grandpa. Man in suit had shown up that day. I remember it clearly because it was the first time I saw my grandfather lie. Just an old friend, he told me afterward, his jaw tight, his eyes not meeting mine. But now I knew that man had offered him king's ransom, and my grandfather had refused. Some things he once told me weren't for sale. The next morning, the envelope appeared, 10 pages, $18,000 in improvements required, 30 days or else. Ellie sent me text. Got one too, meeting tomorrow. Don't miss it. They thought I was just some clueless heir, some outsider with soft heart and short memory. They couldn't have been more wrong. Because while Margaret Winters had clipboards and committees, I had something else. I had land, and land once claimed and defended doesn't need permission to exist. It just is. And it waits like stone, like truth, waiting for the right moment to rise. The morning after the home meeting, I woke to the metallic clatter of machinery outside my cabin. Through the slats of my bedroom blinds, I spotted landscaping crew unloading shrubs, neatly trimmed, painfully identical, into rows beside the gravel drive. A man in a neon vest stood with a clipboard, glancing up at my house like he was inspecting a crime scene. I stepped outside barefoot and still half asleep, asking what they were doing. The foreman, without looking at me, handed over a paper stamped with a silver pine HOA seal. It read, Community Beautification Initiative Phase 2, Frontage Aesthetic Harmonization. No request, no consent. Just declaration. When I told him to leave, the man simply shrugged, said they oppose. A demon hired by the board, and that refusal might incur a fine. It did. By evening, a notice arrived stating I had been affiliated with approved community maintenance. Fine, $500. That was only the beginning. The days that followed blurred into steady drip of passive-aggressive declarations dressed up as bureaucracy. My truck, clearly not recreational and legally registered, was labeled an unauthorized display vehicle. My firewood stack, which had sat safely beside the porch for decades, was now potential fire hazard. The native plants in the front garden, uncontrolled flora, each violation accompanied by dollar amount, each letter colder than the last. It was all so transparent and yet so effective. Death by thousand paper cuts. Margaret Winters and her board weren't coming at me with bulldozers or lawsuits yet. No, they were playing longer game attrition, pressure, exhaustion. They weren't trying to beat me in court. They were trying to make me too tired to show up. But they didn't know I'd already found the file labeled Silver Lake Primary Title Holdings. They didn't know about the maps drawn by hand, traced and updated across 3 decades. They didn't know that I had already met with Sarah Reynolds. Sarah wasn't just any attorney. She was property rights specialist, the kind of person who didn't blink at century-old land claims or the obscure clauses buried in water access law. The first time she saw my grandfather's documents, she leaned back in her chair and whistled. He was preparing for siege, she said, and from the looks of it, he won. When I explained everything, the clubhouse, the dock, the sudden rush to find me out of existence, her arched, do they know you have all this? I shook my head. Good, she said. Then we have the element of surprise. While Sarah combed through deeds and easements, I began documenting everything, every fine, every unauthorized visit, every security camera I found hidden in trees around my property. By the third one, I stopped feeling surprised and started feeling watched, like I was no longer living at home, but inside someone else's narrative. I snapped photos, collected timestamps, and made copies of everything. I even installed few cameras of my own. Pointed outward, one evening, I caught Dave Wilson waiting in his car near the end of my driveway. He wasn't the kind of guy to sneak around, but his posture, hunched behind the wheel, eyes darting, suggested he didn't want to be seen. When I walked over, he rolled down the window halfway and handed me flash drive. You didn't get this from me, he said, but it's everything. Emails, memos, internal board communications. Then he pulled away. That night, I plugged the drive into my laptop and opened folder titled Silver Heights Internal Planning. There were site maps, luxury development proposals, notes about rebranding the Silver Lake image, and buried among them, spreadsheet of properties flagged as aesthetic detractions. My cabin was number 1. Thomas Winters, in message sent to Margaret and the board, had called it the final blemish obstructing our premium lakefront vision. Another email outlined step-by-step eviction plan. Phase 1. Establish noncompliance. Phase 2, escalate fines. Phase 3, initiate legal removal for breach. Community standards. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was afraid, but because I finally understood the stakes. This wasn't misunderstanding. It wasn't about lawn height or paint color. It was about control. And the cabin I'd inherited wasn't just in the way. It was the gatekeeper to everything they needed to complete their scheme. Without the shoreline, the clubhouse, the dock, their promises to buyers at Silver Heights were just fantasy. and they were willing to erase lifetime's legacy to make that fantasy real. The next day, I drove into town to visit the county records office. Brian Cooper, clerk with more files in his head than on his desk, greeted with a smile. Robert's grandson, he said. He talked about you all the time. I laid out my grandfather's maps in the flash drive. Brian leaned over him like he was reading scripture. I remember these filings, he said, especially the lake bed claim and oppose. The 77 water levels dropped during the drought, and Robert purchased the exposed lake bed at auction. Smart move, locked up 60% of the shoreline in perpetuity. I asked him to print certified copies of every related record, title deeds, lease agreements, easement expirations. Brian didn't even flinch. We've got it all, he said. Your grandfather made sure of that. When I returned home, I found another surprise waiting. Ellie Collins was on my porch, flanked by two other neighbors I hadn't met, James, retired teacher, and Nina, nurse. We heard about the landscaping crew, she said, in the truck, and the firewood finds. James added, you're not the only one they've tried to push out, but you're the first one with reason to stay that might actually hold up. And as casually as commenting on the weather, Nina said, we're with you. Just say when. That night, I pulled out my grandfather's journal again. I flipped to the entry dated June 12, 1994. Another offer today, this one from Winters Development. Same pitch, same money, same us. I told him what I always tell him. Some things aren't for sale, not for any price. He had drawn sketch beneath it, map line drawn around the cabin, the trees, the slope down to the water, the outline of the dock, and beneath it all the words in case they forget where the lines are. I spent the next day walking those lines with orange flags and I traced every boundary, every corner, every inch my grandfather had marked. I followed the land down to the edge of the dock, then stepped onto it, imagining his boots in the same place. At the far end, beneath one of the support beams, I found the rusted bolt he'd once pointed out to me as child. This is where they start pushing, he had said. But it's also where they stop. That evening, I walked into the community clubhouse for the monthly meeting, flagged fines in hand. Margaret's face barely concealed her irritation. You again, she said. Did you come to make another speech? I smiled. No, I said. I came to listen. Then I sat in the back, took out a notebook, and wrote down everything they said. Every motion, every financial line item, every offhand remark about enforcement efficiency and streamlining compliance. When they finally adjourned, I didn't say a word. But when I stood to leave, Victor Hayes, their legal counsel, watched me like man beginning to suspect he'd missed something important, because he had. The survey flags were already planted, the certified maps were already notarized, and the war they thought they were winning had just become something else entirely. Not standoff, reckoning. It started with not the polite kind that waits for permission, but the kind that insists loud and deliberate, the kind that says we're watching. When I opened the door, I found folded note pinned to the frame with blue tape. No envelope this time, just a single sheet, typed, bolded, stamped. A special inspection had been scheduled for my property to assess ongoing safety concerns. No specific violation cited, no request for consent, just date, time, and warning. Non-cooperation would result in escalated enforcement. It wasn't just threat, it was dare. I folded the paper slowly, deliberately, and slid it into my back pocket without breaking eye contact with the camera now mounted to the community lamppost across the street. By now I had identified at least 7 surveillance devices aimed at or near my home. None of them mine, all of them installed without consent. Sarah, my attorney, had advised restraint. Let them pile it on, she said. The more they do, the easier it gets to show the pattern. So I played along. I let the inspection team roam the property, clipboards in hand, cameras slung over their shoulders like weapons. They examined my firewood, took photos of the garden, measured the height of native grasses with rulers like they were forensics experts solving murder. One of them crouched to examine the underside of my porch, muttering something about potential structural risks. I offered coffee. No one accepted. They left after 40 minutes, leaving behind fresh scuff marks on my wooden floors and a new round of citations on my door within hours. The fines now totaled over $3,000 and counting. Meanwhile, Sarah was assembling a portfolio thick enough to crack bones. Every notice, every unauthorized entry, every photograph, every statement made in public meetings. But what we needed, what would truly shift the tide, was proof of intent, not suspicion, not whispers, documents, plans, emails, something undeniable, something dirty. That's when Dave called again. You need to come to my place, he said. tonight. I brought Ellie with me just in case. Dave met us at the back door and let us in through the kitchen like fugitives. They've crossed Lime, he said without preamble. Then he opened his laptop and turned the screen toward us. There was series of internal emails, time-stamped board addressed, Margaret and Thomas detailing the reclamation strategy for my property. The language was corporate, bloodless, but the intent was crystal clear. They referred to my cabin as a legacy obstruction and discussed strategies to prompt voluntary relocation by making conditions untenable. One email even attached proposed buyout letter. Unsigned but with valuation well below market value, whereas another message revealed plans for Phase 2 acquisition detailing future attempts to secure exclusive access to the lake by removing non-conforming usage zones, which included not only land but parts of Ellie's shoreline too. They are trying to turn this place into gated enclave, Ellie whispered, like lake with walls. Dave also showed us draft architectural renderings labeled Silver Heights Expansion Lake Access Gateway on my dock. The one built by my grandfather, the one technically sitting on my water rights, was marked as the main entry point. My property was literally drawn into their blueprints without permission. They're not just dreaming, I said. They're planning. The next morning, I took walk down to the dock, needing air, needing silence. But the silence was broken by splash. Metal on water. I found maintenance crew marking sections of the dock with orange spray paint. When asked, they pointed to a work order from the HOA for community dock enhancements. I asked to see the permit, bore Margaret's signature, and claimed the HOA as the legal owner of the entire structure, which of course they weren't. I called Sarah immediately. Within the hour, she had contacted the sheriff's office. Deputy Hart arrived late afternoon, slow and skeptical, but his tone changed when he saw my certified maps and the lease expiration notice from the county. This could be civil, he said, but if they falsified this permit. He left with copies of everything. That night, I installed more cameras, this time inside. It felt paranoid, until it didn't. Around 2 a.m., one of the outdoor sensors triggered. I checked the feed and saw two figures near the edge of my property, flashlights. Not teenagers, not drunk, intentional. I zoomed in, Margaret and Thomas walking the survey line, whispering, measuring the cameras. Mike couldn't pick up much, but one phrase stood out. Margaret hissing through clenched teeth. We need to get ahead of this. The next day, the town received an anonymous complaint alleging my property was being used for unauthorized short-term rentals. I don't even own spare key. The allegation triggered zoning review, another delay, another wall. And then came the rock. I'd just gotten back from meeting with Sarah when I found my kitchen window shattered. Jagged stone sat on the floor, scrap of notebook paper taped to its side. So I'd scanned the footage, lone figure hood up in and out in under 20 seconds. But I recognized the gate. Victor Hayes, the HOA's legal counsel. Sarah filed restraining order that night and formal criminal complaint the next morning. But the break-in wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what they'd taken. Folder, not digital, not replaceable. Original deeds, hand-drawn maps. The notes my grandfather had written in the margins. Proof not just of ownership, but of intent. I stared at the empty spot in the desk drawer like it had been amputated. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to despair, not because I'd lost a piece of paper, but because it meant they were desperate. Desperate people don't stop, they escalate. Just as the weight of it began to close in, my phone rang. Ellie, her voice sharp, urgent, breathless. Frank found something. You need to come now. Frank Miller, the unofficial historian of Silver Lake, greeted me at his front porch in pajamas and worn flannel. I knew it rang bells, he said, leading me to dusty cabinet in the back room. He laid out series of laminated documents. County records, newspaper clippings, archive photos. This is the original filing from the drought year, he said, pointing to yellowed map. Your grandfather bought that lake bid fair and square. The deed was recorded twice. Once at the courthouse and once in the Historical Society archives. He slid over stamped copy. This, he said, tapping the paper. This they can't steal, because they don't even know it exists. I left with folder under my arm and something heavier lifting from my chest. Hope, but not blind hope, calculated, documented. Ironclad, we were no longer on the defensive. We were ready to move. Margaret and Thomas didn't know it yet. But the cabin they tried to erase was about to become the cornerstone of their unraveling. They had awakened something far older and more rooted than they could ever bulldoze. They had pulled too hard on a thread without realizing it was tied to the entire fabric. And when that fabric tore, I would be waiting, holding every stitch of truth in my hands. The hearing was 4 weeks away, but the atmosphere in Silver Pine had already shifted. The air felt taut, stretched between hushed conversations and eyes that lingered just a second too long. I noticed it in that diner when conversation paused as I walked in. I noticed it in the mail. 3 anonymous flyers warning of dangerous precedents and community destruction with my name not mentioned but clearly implied. I noticed it in the way Margaret stopped smiling altogether. No more pleasant facades, no more passive-aggressive charm. Just cold eyes and sharp words when we passed each other at the mailbox. The survey flags I'd placed around the property still stood, orange and defiant, marking out the exact legal borders of my land. Each day I walked the perimeter, checking them like a sentry. Once I found a few pushed over, I put them back up. Then came the truck, a massive flatbed with no license plates parked across my driveway early one morning, blocking my access completely. No one claimed ownership. No one saw who parked it. I had to call a tow truck to remove it. Cost me $200. And right on cue, I received a fresh HOA violation that afternoon for unauthorized vehicle activity causing neighborhood disruption. Fine, $450. That same evening, I got a text from Dave Wilson, emergency board meeting tonight. They're calling your flags hostile encroachment. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. Dave recorded. I listened later that night, the audio grainy but clear. Margaret was in rare form, her voice rising with each sentence. We cannot let one individual disrupt the integrity of this community, she said. If we don't act decisively, we invite chaos. Victor sounded less sure if he's got documentation. He muttered, it's getting harder. Then we shift the narrative, she snapped. We make this about property values, not boundaries. Not safety, image. If we lose the aesthetics, we lose everything. I paused the recording and stared at the ceiling. They weren't protecting Silver Pine. They were preserving the illusion that they owned it. The next morning, new development. Glossy HOA newsletter had been slid under every door. On page 3, full spread titled, Protecting Our Community, warned of rogue property disputes threatening shared values. The accompanying photo was heavily edited, image of my cabin shot from distance to make it look like crumbling shack. At the bottom in smaller print, the phrase, Silver Pine must stand united or fall divided. I walked outside, sat on the porch, and watched the lake for a long time. That's when Thomas Winters approached. No pretense this time, no legal shield, just him walking slowly up the gravel path, hands in his pockets. You're playing dangerous game, he said. Not unkindly, not kindly either. You're putting your name on fight. That doesn't have to happen. I didn't respond. He continued, you're standing in the way of progress, the future of this place. I looked at him. Really looked. Polished shoes, tailored jeans, that permanent squint developers wear when imagining renderings over reality. No, I said, I'm standing where my grandfather stood. The only thing I'm in the way of is your shortcut. His expression hardened. You think this is about shortcuts. Silver Heights is $50 million project. You're not just man with cabin, your liability. Then he smiled. Everything has price, Trevor. I suggest you find yours. I didn't smile back. I already did. It's not for sale. That night, my water stopped. Completely. When I called a plumber, he found the main line near the road had been severed. Cleanly, intentionally, repairs cost me $800. Day later, I got violation notice from the HOA. Unauthorized excavation on community land. Fine, $500. Sarah, my attorney, reviewed everything and shook her head. They're poking you with sticks, trying to trigger reaction. Good with them, it's all going in the file. She handed me another folder. The counterclaim tomorrow. Harassment, trespassing, fraud, permit falsification, environmental violation. We have the records, the soil samples, the stolen documents, the camera footage. And now we have motive. Let them come. Still, it escalated. I began to notice unfamiliar cars parked near my lot. Community patrol suddenly doubled their rounds past my property, driving by every 15 minutes like clockwork. At night, they shone their floodlights directly through my windows. I started sleeping in short bursts, waking to check the cameras, half expecting something worse each time. And then something worse came. One afternoon, I found construction crew at the community dock with jackhammers and measuring equipment. They were preparing for what their foreman called structural upgrades. When I demanded to see the permits, they showed me fresh set. Again signed by Margaret, again claiming full ownership of the dock area. I showed them my certified maps. They paused, unsure. That's when the sheriff's office arrived. Deputy Hart, calm and meticulous, reviewed both documents. This isn't just property dispute anymore, he said. If they filed this knowing they don't own it, it's permit fraud. He ordered the crew to stop all work pending court review. Margaret was furious. She arrived 10 minutes later, flanked by 2 board members and a community security officer. This is obstruction, she shouted. You don't have the right to stop community development. I do, I replied, holding up the notice I'd prepared. This is formal legal notification. Your clubhouse and dock are currently sitting on my land, and unless new lease agreement is signed within 30 days, they'll be considered unauthorized structures. She turned red, then pale. You're bluffing. I stepped closer, calm. deliberate. No, I'm reminding you where the line is. And this time it's marked in court filings. Within an hour, another emergency board meeting was called. Dave Everloyal recorded again. This time there was panic in the room. Victor's voice was tight. We're exposed if he's right. And by the looks of the maps, he is. Then we've been collecting dock fees illegally. That's financial misconduct. Margaret tried to rally. Then we take back control. We file an injunction. Frame it as rogue actor threatening peace. But even her voice had lost its edge. Word was spreading. More neighbors began approaching me quietly at the market. Outside the diner, we've had enough, one said. Silver Pine used to be neighborly. Now it's just hostile. Ellie organized small gathering at her cabin. About a dozen residents showed up sharing their own stories of fines. Threats, violations, invented out of nothing. We don't want to take sides, one said. But if you're the side standing for the truth, maybe it's time we stop pretending neutrality is noble. I didn't ask them for anything. I just listened. The truth didn't need microphone. It only needed space to echo. 2 days later, Dave delivered the final blow. A file of financial records leaked from inside the HOA. Payments made to shell companies tied to Thomas's development firm. Consulting contracts with no deliverables. Dock rental fees pocketed off record. Separate HOA account used for. Aesthetic enforcement initiatives, all under Margaret's signature. We submitted everything to the county commission. And just to be sure the truth didn't stay hidden, we sent copies to the local paper. That weekend, the headline across the front page, Developer HOA President under fire for land dispute and financial misconduct. Beneath it, photo of the lake, my cabin in the background. The article ended with a quote from Frank Miller. Robert Thornton saved this lake once. Maybe now his grandson will save it again. I read it in silence, then folded the paper and slid it into my grandfather's journal, bookmark, not for memory, for just as still unfolding, because the hearing wasn't just about land anymore. It was about power, the illusion of it, the abuse of it, and what happens when someone refuses to bow. The hearing took place on Thursday morning under sky so still it felt rehearsed. The Silver Pine Community Center, which had never seen more than 30 chairs filled at once, was packed wall to wall. Neighbors who hadn't opposed. A tea spoken in years were now seated shoulder to shoulder, some with arms crossed in suspicion, others leaning forward with a kind of quiet hope. At one end of the room sat Margaret Winters, Thomas, and Victor, all dressed in muted authority. Gray's Navy, no risks. Across the aisle sat Sarah, calm and composed in black blade. Stack of labeled binders in front of her like chess pieces ready to move. I sat beside her, hands still, eyes locked ahead. My cabin may have been the battlefield, but this was the war pose. Thus last open field, the commissioner called the room to order and allowed both parties to present. Margaret's attorney spoke first, reading from carefully curated statement. He framed the conflict as tragic misunderstanding, positioning me as confused heir, misinterpreting old documents. He waved away our claims as inaccurate interpretations of expired easements and called my actions disruptive to community cohesion. He showed drone photos, property emphasizing how outdated and non-conforming structures could affect property values. Then he displayed a slide with a bold headline, not personal. Just standards. Margaret never looked at me. She kept her eyes forward, jaw tense. When their side finished, Sarah stood without notes, without slides. She began by placing single document on the table in front of the commissioner, the certified deed to the lake bed bearing my grandfather's signature and the county seal, and she spoke. Not with theatrical force, but with surgical calm, she laid out the chronology, the ownership transfer, the lease expiration, the encroachments, the illegal permits. She presented photos of the security cameras aimed at my windows, the vandalism to my truck, the broken water main, the surveillance footage of Victor entering my cabin and removing documents. Then she walked through the financial trail. Dock fees collected, off-record vendor contracts funneled through shell companies, funds redirected for aesthetic enforcement operations, all corroborated by the HOAs, thus own internal communications provided by Dave. Lastly, she introduced Ellie, who presented her students' oppose. Water sample data showing elevated runoff pollutants from the Silver Heights site. Ellie stood without notes, hands only slightly shaking, and calmly explained how the northern shoreline, the one under my control, had cleaner, healthier samples than the south side where Thomas's crews had been clearing trees and pouring concrete. Then Frank took the stand. He brought county archive copies of the 1977 drought auction and confirmed that he had personally documented Robert Thornton's legal purchase of the exposed lakebed. Dispute, he said plainly. This isn't about interpretation. This is about facts. The land belongs to Istrid Thornton. Always has. Then Sarah played the audio from one of the HOA meetings. Margaret's voice calling for shift in narrative, a Victor warning of legal exposure. Thomas referencing. Lobstacles to the Silver Heights roll out. The room was silent except for her voice, looped over the speakers, cool and clipped. If we lose the aesthetics, we lose everything. When we finished, the commissioner called for short recess. Outside, I walked toward the lake, needing air. I didn't notice Thomas until he stepped up beside me. You got what you wanted, he said, voice flat. You win the lake, the dock. A pity parade. I turned to face him. This was never about winning. It was about not losing something sacred. He looked at the water like it betrayed him. You killed the development. You killed what this place could have been. I nodded slowly. No. I just stopped you from selling it second time. Back inside, the ruling came swift. The commission validated my ownership of the lake bed, the dock, the land beneath the clubhouse, and invalidated all violations and fines levied against me. More than that, the case was referred to the district attorney for investigation into fraud, permit falsification, and misuse of funds. The audience was silent, no gasps, just stillness. Margaret stood slowly, eyes empty, and walked out without a word. Victor followed her, shoulders caved inward. Thomas didn't move. He sat still, staring at the table, hands gripping his knees like he was waiting for some version of this to rewind. It didn't in the days that fall. Everything shifted. Margaret and Thomas both resigned from the HOA board. Victor offered to cooperate in exchange for leniency. Several of the previous violation cases filed against homeowners were reviewed and overturned. A special election was held. Dave was unanimously voted in as the new president. His first order of business: negotiate a new lease with me for the clubhouse and dock. This time written transparently, reviewed by both parties, and publicly archived. The second, end the enforcement campaign. The third, announce community conservation initiative to protect the undeveloped shoreline from future projects. At Dave's request, I agreed to grant continued community access to the dock, now formally renamed Thornton Pier, on one condition: no development, no dredging, no destruction. Just the lake as it had been, as it should remain. I began restoring the cabin with slow, deliberate care. Solar panels replaced the aging electrical system. The roof was reinforced. I kept the logs unpainted, the porch unpolished, the imperfections intact. I added a bench under the pine tree where my grandfather used to sit and write. I replanted the front with more native flora, and over time, other neighbors followed, ripping up artificial turf, letting wildflowers grow. Something softened in silver pine. Ellie started Community Ecology Club. James, the retired teacher, volunteered to teach local history classes using Frank's archives. The HOA meetings became shorter, less punitive, more neighborly, and just once, Margaret returned. She didn't knock, just stood at the edge of the property, staring at the dock, arms crossed. When I saw her, I walked out but said nothing. After a long silence, she said, "You know, Robert never liked me." I shrugged. He respected persistence. She looked down at her shoes. "I didn't come to apologize. I didn't ask you to." She nodded once and left. That was enough. On the anniversary of the hearing, we held a gathering by the lake. Children played where they once weren't allowed. Neighbors shared food on picnic tables repurposed from the old maintenance shed. Frank gave short speech. Dave said few words. Then Ellie pointed to the dock. "This pier," she said, "isn't just named after Robert Thornton because he owned it. It's named for the man who refused to let us forget that ownership isn't the same as stewardship." That night, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I took out my grandfather's rowboat and pushed quietly into the water. I let the oars rest, let the lake carry me. In the stillness, I could almost hear his voice. Not words, just presence, the kind that lingers not because it haunts, but because it held its ground. I didn't win war. I kept promise, and sometimes that's the only kind of victory that matters.